Hi, welcome to another episode of BTS Presents Community Cafe. I'm your host, Datta Khalsa. This evening we're going to discuss the Covid-19 coronavirus, and to get us kind of on the topic, we'll go to video of a recent show that was broadcast nationally.
We're cutting through the fear and getting facts from one of the best people ever. She's our ABC News chief medical correspondent, Dr. Jennifer Ashton. So, you know, everybody's got a million questions, lots of fear-mongering going on out there, so we can't stop talking about it. And you've been speaking directly with the CDC. You've been to the Vaccine Development Lab. And so when you see a press conference and someone says basically everything is fine, not to worry, is that a good way to sort of put it out? What would you say to folks?
Well, I'm glad we have an hour. Listen, I think this is an incredibly interesting story. It's evolving. It changes every day. We have some of the smartest doctors, scientists, public health officials working on this, not just here in this country, but worldwide. It is anxiety-producing. In medicine and science, we like to know history on things, just like in life. We don't have a lot of history on this. And sometimes, from my perspective, medically, there's a disconnect between actions and words.
Right.
And I think that both are important, but I look at this really as a doctor and as a scientist and as a physician, which is no different, even though there are potentially millions of people affected by this. I look at it like an individual patient, and it's hard to see people who are, I like to say, stay in your lane. Mm-hmm. That means doctors and scientists kind of address this. So, when I see politicians and government officials and public health officials all getting into one sandbox, it can get a little messy.
Yeah.
So,
But Trump said to treat the coronavirus as the flu. Is that right?
well, listen, I think our biggest concern to you at home right now, today, is influenza.
It's the flu.
It's not coronavirus. And we have to remember, it's
Well, what's
not
the
just
difference?
different family. So
Yeah.
the Goldberg family, the Ashton family, the McCain family, they're all respiratory viruses, and they're not the only ones. There's rhinovirus, adenovirus, respiratory syncytial virus.
I think I'm rhinovirus.
So they behave differently, and we know a lot about influenza virus, but you know what? Coronavirus isn't brand new. This strain is new, but it was first identified
But corona
in the
is more
60s.
deadly than the flu. That's one of the differences.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to get into numbers. That is, in my opinion, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, because we don't have a good grasp right now on the numbers, okay? When we hear 80,000 cases worldwide, the 80,000 to me is less interesting than how many people have been exposed, how many people infected, how many people are tested.
There's no way to know half of that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So a number in isolation, you have to take it with not a grain of salt, but a chunk of salt, because you can't interpret anything in isolation. Right now, according to the CDC, this is a highly transmissible virus with a low mortality or fatality rate, and that's really important right now.
I mean, I hate to interrupt everybody, but I read somewhere that it's like the Spanish flu back in the day, which killed 50 million people.
But
is that
things
true or
are
not
very
true?
different in 2020 than they were in 1918.
I get that. I
And
was
that,
there.
and a
believe
lot
me,
of.
But I mean,
You look so good.
I know, don't I? But I mean, I read that somewhere, and it's like, really, that many people are going to die from this?
So you actually, not the Spanish flu is important with your comment, Joy. What's important is I read that somewhere. One of the biggest problems with this story is where people get information and where people get misinformation. And you have to get your information from credible, credentialed sources. If you don't, not only does it not do you any good, it can actually endanger public health in the response.
We have with us on this episode a noted biological anthropologist, Dennis Etler. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
And amongst other things, I understand that you are, if not an authority, at least an expert on the COVID-19 coronavirus.
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, but I have been following it very closely, and I do have a background in biological anthropology, so I'm conversant with genetics and other, immunology, virology, in a broad sense, probably more so than most people.
And you actually spent time in Wuhan.
Yeah, I had a postdoc back in the late 90s in Wuhan. My colleague was affiliated with the Archaeological Institute in Wuhan, and I was doing postdoctoral research there. So I spent 2 full years in Wuhan and had visited there previously and have since gone back. So I'm very familiar with Wuhan and Hubei province itself, and I spent a decade or more, in China on an annual basis, traveled all over the country, speak the language, wow. And, I did all my research in China for my doctorate.
Okay, well that's a good background, I'd say, that gives you more authority to speak on the topic than me. What's the history of this particular strain of the virus? How long ago did you start looking at coronaviruses in general?
Well, I wasn't really particularly interested in, there's no call for me, except other than the fact that there was the SARS epidemic back in the early 2000s, I think it was 2003, but that was centered more in southern China around Hong Kong and Guangdong and whatnot. So I was broadly knowledgeable about that, and this latest virus cropped up sometime in early December. The first case that has now been recorded. It wasn't recognized at the time, but sort of tracing things back, it seems like December 8th would have been, when the first known patient, contracted the virus and came down with the disease, which is now called COVID-19.
And that's a new name?
The name, there's been a few permutations, but this is the name that has been applied by the World Health Organization, WHO, in consultation with the Chinese who have been studying this since they recognized it, and it's called COVID-19.
And what differentiates it from, say, SARS, for example?
Okay, well, there are other similar types of viruses. There's the SARS virus, and there's the MERS virus, which was in the Middle East a few years back. The thing is, both SARS and MERS are very lethal. The fatality rate for SARS is about 10%, which is extremely high for
So just to clarify, if you contract the SARS virus, you have a 1 in 10 chance
of dying.
Yeah,
wow.
Regardless of age.
Well, of course, generally speaking, these viruses, you're much more susceptible to these viruses if you're older and have some sort of immunodeficiency.
Okay.
If you're young and healthy, it's not to say you might not succumb to it, but the chances are much greater that you'll recover.
And then the rate of spreading, how far did SARS get worldwide?
Well, see, let me continue with the MERS was even more lethal. MERS had about a 50% fatality rate. So
these are both respiratory?
These are both respiratory. They're in the same family,
as corona.
This sort of SARS, coronavirus family.
Okay.
Coronaviruses are a large family, which also includes, the common cold, the virus that gives you the common cold, and many other conditions. But these two severe respiratory, viruses.
10% and 50%.
Yeah.
So where does COVID-19 come in?
Right. So just to finish up with, SARS and MERS, even though they had a very high fatality rate, they were not all that contagious. There were only about 8,000 patients for SARS and far fewer for MERS.
Worldwide?
Worldwide.
Wow.
Yeah, mostly concentrated in the area where they originated. They did spread somewhat out from there, but it wasn't a pandemic in the sense that where there were hundreds of thousands or millions of people who came down with it. Right. So it was very limited in extent, but very lethal. So it was considered very.
Stop for a second, and there's a term we're starting to hear more often: pandemic. So where does it go from epidemic to pandemic?
Okay, an epidemic is more localized.
Right.
So an epidemic would be like in Wuhan. That's an epidemic.
And epi is the center, so it's
Epi means, yeah, so the epicenter, you know,
Right.
so, and a pandemic means extremely widespread, you know, across many countries, you know, transcontinental and the like. So, you know, as it's centered in Wuhan and to a lesser extent in Hubei province, which Wuhan is the capital of, it would be considered an epidemic.
but now.
Yeah, but now it's beginning to spread out from there, but that's another story. But getting back to COVID-19, the thing is, it's not nearly as lethal as SARS or MERS.
So mortality rate being
The mortality rate, based on what we've seen in Wuhan and Hubei, it's between 2 and 3%.
I heard 1.5, but
Yeah,
that's
well,
what I mean. Yeah.
you know, it varies. You know, what I, you know, based on the statistics,
Yeah.
it's around actually, you know, on the upper scale, 2.5 to 3.5%. But that's really kind of iffy because that's based on those cases that have been confirmed. Of course, many people come down with the virus and they don't have any idea that they have it because you can have the virus and it can be asymptomatic or it can be very mild. The vast majority of people, the virus is, you know, relatively mild, not much different than the common cold or a mild case of flu. About 80% of people might not even recognize that they have something, you know, that warrants medical attention other than, you know, just the normal type of, you know, things you do when you come down with the flu.
So what telltale signs would you tell somebody to look for to say, okay, this isn't
Okay,
this
so
isn't
now-
Theraflu time. This is
basically,
serious.
you know, you can pretty well tell if you need medical assistance, right? You know, like if the symptoms are getting so severe that you think you need to be looked at by a doctor, then you should be concerned. Most likely going to be the flu, but there's a chance that it could be something else. You know, the coronavirus. And the symptoms are very similar. So, but the thing is, if it does go in the direction of severity, you know, it can be, you know, quite severe. And the type of damage, the type of pneumonia that this virus results in is distinct from other forms of viral pneumonia.
And I understand it attacks the kidneys as well in advanced.
It can attack various elements, you know, various organ systems in the body, but primarily focused on the lungs.
Okay.
Yeah.
And course of treatment, what are doctors doing right now?
Well, you know, there are antiviral drugs of a wide variety, and they're still, you know, seeing which ones are most effective. It's also been shown that some of the drugs associated with, you know, HIV and Ebola are effective. The Chinese are using a lot of their traditional Chinese medicine, and they've been very, very successful because those cases that have been hospitalized in China, over half of them have been cured.
Wow.
So they've, you know, of course, they've had a relatively high death rate, you know, 2 to 3%. So they have almost 3,000 deaths, but something like 40 to 50,000 have already been, you know, cleared. So, you know, they're making great progress. And the thing is, the virus, because of the clampdown in China, there's been a quarantine. The whole city was basically shut down, and Hubei province, the virus has not spread to the rest of China. The cases in the other provinces of China are plummeting. You know, they were never very large in number, and now they're almost there's almost no instance of the virus outside of that central area where it first appeared. Now, the one other thing about this coronavirus is that it is very contagious. Unlike SARS and MERS, it's extremely contagious.
Airborne.
Not
For example,
airborne.
no?
No.
Okay.
It's basically a physical contact. That's why washing hands, sanitizing surfaces are essential.
I took an airplane flight recently, and it was amazing the number of people that had face masks on.
Oh,
So-
yeah, people are wearing face masks all over China, all over
But
Asia.
that's not,
But
in your opinion?
in actual fact, the face mask it's not going to hurt wearing a face mask, but it's not really going to prevent contracting the virus. It's basically physical contact.
Hands to face.
Hands to face, and other ways, fecal matter, and one of the sources of
So
it.
political debates, for example, would be a highly contagious environment. No.
Right. So anyway, it is more contagious, and the reason for its being more contagious is that it has certain genetic features similar to what we see in Ebola and HIV, which allows the virus to more easily enter into the cell. There's a pathway, I won't get into the details, but there's a genetic pathway where there's actually an enzyme that this coronavirus recruits that allows it to enter into the cell much more efficiently than SARS or MERS. So it's much more contagious, but it's a fraction of the lethality.
Right.
Now, just to continue in that vein, the problem is the flu, the seasonal flu, influenza, has an even lower fatality rate. And it's
roughly what?
0.1%. So you're talking about this coronavirus
25 to 30
10
times.
to 30 times more contagious. Not more contagious.
More lethal.
More lethal. As contagious, but 10 to 20 times more lethal. So that's why people are concerned. I mean, that's why the medical profession is concerned. See, for now, we've had around 35 million people who come down with the flu this flu season.
Right.
And we've had about 18,000 deaths. Sounds like a lot, right? But when you factor in, so many people come down with the flu, 18,000 is a very small percentage who have died, as complications. That's about 0.1%, actually somewhat less than that.
And how are those broken down demographically, by age? Is there any, because they talk a lot about with the coronavirus it being largely, I've heard, 70% are over the age of 60. I mean, there's the flu.
Yeah. All of these, respiratory diseases.
So similar in
have a similar sort of profile. Okay. So the older you are, the more endangered you are. So if you're in your 80s, you have a much greater chance of having the disease going into a severe manifestation. The younger you are, the healthier you are, the less likely it's going to manifest in that fashion. And the other thing is, if you have any other sort of pre-existing condition where your immune system is compromised, diabetes, a heart condition, HIV, or any other sort of immunodeficiency of that sort, of course you're going to be more susceptible.
Okay. Well, CDC.gov is putting out a directive. Their public health division has given some guidelines in terms of being prepared. And I'll just read verbatim. So it says, limiting community impacts locally. Any risk assessments are based on travel history and contacts, not race, ethnicity, or culture. So we advise residents to reduce their risk of getting sick by taking measures typical of other seasonal colds or flu viruses, including washing hands regularly with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, cover your cough or sneeze using proper technique, stay home and avoid public crowded areas if you're sick, get your flu shot to protect against flu or symptoms similar to COVID-19, and if you have recently returned from regions with ongoing COVID impacts, monitor your health and immediately contact your physician if you experience flu-like symptoms. You can also prepare for the possible disruption caused by an outbreak. Make sure you have a supply of all essential medications for your entire family. Make a child care plan if you or a caregiver are sick. Make arrangements about how your family will manage a school closure. And make a plan for how you can care for a sick family member without getting sick yourself. And to that last point, as I understand it, the original doctor who had diagnosed and treated the case, I believe, ended up dying from the...
Yeah, that's a story that's been totally misinterpreted.
Is that urban myth or is that true?
Well, that's not an urban myth, but the way it's been distorted is, it's been used to suggest that the Chinese authorities were trying to censor knowledge of the outbreak, which is just not true. Actually, he was one of the first. He's an ophthalmologist, so he was an ophthalmologist. So he's not trained in virology or
Right.
contagious diseases, but he did notice some patients at the hospital where he worked who had symptoms very similar to SARS. And he contacted some of his colleagues in a chat room and said, "Hey, be careful. It looks like there might be something like SARS that's cropping up." And then, his colleagues then began spreading this online. He didn't go through the proper channels. He didn't consult with his superiors or anybody. He just
went to his colleagues.
He just went to his colleagues to warn them. Well, just like here, the internet is monitored here as well as everywhere else, and it came to the attention of the local authorities that someone was spreading rumors about a new SARS epidemic. So they consulted him, they reprimanded him, saying, don't spread rumors, and then,
rumors are also contagious.
yeah, so then he was, sort of said, kind of, don't do that. And then he went back to work. At the very same time, and this is well documented because I, consult all the sources that are available in English and Chinese. At the very same time, there were other doctors in Wuhan who also noticed this outbreak. And they went through the proper channels. They went to the Chinese equivalent of the CDC and told them, hey, something's going on in Wuhan. And they sent down an investigation team. And they identified that this was a new variant of SARS-like virus. It's in the same family. It's considered a SARS virus, about 85% identical to the SARS virus. And then after that, just as anywhere else, this is a newly discovered variant. So they had to confirm it and investigate it, try to find out where it originated. At this time, it hadn't spread very far.
So let's talk about that. There's the fruit market, or the meat market
Right.
theory, and then there's the clandestine, genome lab or
Those
virus
are both,
lab.
those are conspiracy theories.
Okay, so what
Not
really
the
happened?
fruit market per se. Now, the fruit market, it's not really, it's a wildlife market, and that's now been discarded as a potential source because there are documented instances of people who had no contact with the market who contracted the virus, prior to that. So it seems as if the virus emerged earlier, in people who had no contact. The earliest instances are people who had no contact with that market.
Okay. Then there's the lab.
The virus
lab.
I looked into that.
Supposedly the largest one in China.
No.
Okay.
That's nonsense.
Okay.
It's people online. They take a thread and they pull at it. Turns out there is a local branch of a pharmaceutical company based in Shanghai that has a lab in Wuhan. Wuhan's a major city. So there's
11 million people?
11 million people. So there's obviously going to be all sorts of pharmaceutical companies and everything, but there's no substance to that.
So where do you think it started?
Well, we don't know. Right now, people are still looking for the first instance or the origination of the virus, but that's a very difficult task. It took decades to figure out where the HIV virus came from. The AIDS virus, we still don't know for sure.
Well, that was from monkeys? Or
that's
golden monkeys, supposedly.
Yeah, but it took a long time to trace
but
that.
At a certain point, it's like, well, what's the point of that? What we have is, a possible pandemic and people looking for solutions. You're not you don't do immunology, but what do you think in terms of the prospects of a vaccine being developed, given that efficacy for the common cold is that what 50% for that vaccine or
with the flu?
Yeah, with the flu. Yeah,
it's about 45% effective. Now, getting back to tracing the origin, it's very important to try to understand where this originated. But at this point, the latest information is we really don't know. There's even some speculation, which I don't really know whether it should be taken with anything but a grain of salt that it might have originated outside of China, and that people just didn't recognize it, and that it, like in Italy, it seems that this virus may have been lurking in Italy for a number of weeks, if not longer.
Maybe it's pasta.
What's that?
Maybe it's pasta. I don't know.
Right. So we really don't know the origins. Most likely, it came from bats because this type of coronavirus is similar to what we see in bats, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people were eating bats or had contact physically with bats, because in China, as throughout Asia and elsewhere in the world, guano, you're familiar with what guano is, was a droppings.
It's used for fertilizer, too.
Yeah, bird droppings, bat droppings, is a very, very efficient fertilizer traditionally used for thousands of years in an agricultural country like China. So people would go to caves where the bats, hang out, right? Bats like caves.
Yeah.
Bat cave, we all know about the bat cave, right?
Yeah.
And they collect guano. Well, it's very dusty. And if there's viruses in this, in the droppings, because the virus is found in fecal material, it could be very easily get inhaled or whatever.
So another suspect is
it could be guano mining or whatever. We really don't know. It needs a lot of investigation before people come up with all sorts of speculation.
Okay. Well, our time is probably close to an end. I would speculate. I'm no expert, but if they could figure out a way to somehow address the enzyme that helps transmit it, that might be
they're working on it. The Chinese were very quick in sequencing it, and they made it public, and now others all over the world are working on a vaccine that's going to be expedited. We should have a vaccine for trial within a couple of months, which is really quick, but then it has to be tested. That can take 6 months to a year or longer. So the vaccine won't be available until sometime late this year or early next year.
So in the meantime, go to cdc.gov and look for updates there. And I understand also, amongst other things, you're active. You're going to be handling some local events around International Women's Day.
I'm also president of the local United Nations Association. And we have an annual International Women's Day event, which will be held this coming Saturday, the 7th, from 12 to 4 at the Resource Center for Nonviolence. Okay. And this is the first year we'll be presenting a Woman of Courage Award in honor of our late long-term president, Pat Arnold. And we also have a soup and bread lunch that we've been serving over the years.
Well, thank you for your work there and in also helping enlighten us a little bit more about this mysterious virus that's so far driven the stock market down by a few thousand points.
Yeah, right.
We'll see how that goes.
Right.
And thank you again for joining us, as usual. We appreciate it.
And thanks a lot.
And we'll both go wash our hands now.
Yeah, really.
So, all right, thank you very much.